Chapter 46, The Tale of Roderick Roach. You might think Bert would be terrified at the sound of these words, but believe it or not, the voice filled him with relief. He'd recognized it, you see, so instead of putting up his hands or pleading for his life, he turned around and found himself looking at Roderick Roach. "What are you smiling about?" growled Roderick, staring into Bert's filthy face. "I know you're not going to stab me, Roddy," said Bert quietly. Even though Roderick was the one holding the sword, Bert could tell the other boy was far more scared than he was. The shivering Roderick was wearing a coat over his pajamas, and his feet were wrapped in blood-stained rags. "Have you walked all the way from Chauville like that?" asked Bert. "That's none of your business," spat Roderick, trying to look fierce though his teeth were chattering. "I'm taking you in, Beamish, you traitor." "No, you aren't," said Bert, and he pulled the sword out of Roderick's hand. At that, Roderick burst into tears. "Come on," said Bert kindly, and he put his arm around Roderick's shoulder and led him down a side alley away from the fluttering wanted poster. "Get off," sobbed Roderick, shrugging away Bert's arm. "Get off me, it's all your fault." "What's my fault?" asked Bert, as the two boys came to a halt beside bins full of some empty wine bottles. "You ran away from my father," said Roderick, wiping his eyes on his sleeve. "Well, of course I did," said Bert reasonably. "He wanted to kill me. But now he's been killed," sobbed Roderick. "Major Roach is dead?" said Bert, taken aback. "How?" "Spittleworth," sobbed Roderick. "He came to our house with soldiers when nobody could find you. He was so angry Father hadn't caught you. He grabbed a soldier's gun, and he..." Roderick sat down on a dustbin and wept. A cold wind blew down the alleyway. This, Bert thought, showed just how dangerous Spittleworth was. If he could shoot dead his faithful head of the Royal Guard, nobody was safe. "How did you know I'd come to Jeroboam?" Bert asked. "Cankerby from the palace told me. I gave him 5 ducats. He remembered your mother talking about your cousin owning a tavern." "How many people do you think Cankerby told?" asked Bert, now worried. "Plenty, probably," said Roderick, mopping his face with his pajama sleeve. "He'll sell anyone information for gold." "That's rich coming from you," said Bert, getting angry. "You were about to sell me for 100 ducats. "I didn't want the gold," said Roderick. "It was for my mother's and brothers. I thought I might be able to get them if I turned you in. Spittleworth took them away. I escaped out my bedroom window. That's why I'm in my pajamas." "I escaped from my bedroom window too," said Bert. "But at least I had the sense to bring shoes. Come on, we'd better get out of here," he added, pulling Roderick to his feet. "We'll try and steal you some socks off a washing line on the way." But they'd taken barely a couple of steps when a man's voice spoke from behind him. "Morning. Hands up, you two are coming with me." Both boys raised their hands and turned around. A man with a dirty, mean face had just emerged from the shadows and was pointing a rifle at them. He wasn't in uniform, and neither Bert nor Roderick recognized him, but Daisy Dovetail could have told them exactly who he was. Basher John, Ma Grunter's deputy, now a full-grown man. Basher John took a few steps closer, squinting from one boy to the other. "Yeah," he said, "you two will do. Give me that sword." With a rifle pointed at his chest, Bert had no choice but to hand it over. However, he wasn't quite as scared as he might have been because Bert, whatever Flapoon might have told him, was actually a clever boy. The dirty-looking man didn't seem to realize he just caught a fugitive worth 100 gold ducats. He seemed to have been looking for any two boys, though why, Bert could only imagine. Roderick, on the other hand, had turned deathly pale. He knew Spittleworth had spies in every city and was convinced that they both were about to be handed over to the chief advisor, and that he, Roderick Roach, would be put to death for being in league with the traitor. "Move," said the blunt-faced man, gesturing them out of the alley with his rifle. With the gun at their backs, Bert and Roderick were forced away through the streets of Jeroboam until finally they reached the door of Ma Grunter's orphanage. Chapter 47, Down in the Dungeons. The kitchen workers in the palace were most surprised to hear from Lord Spittleworth that Mrs. Beamish had requested her own separate kitchen because she was so much more important than they were. Indeed, some of them were suspicious because Mrs. Beamish had never been stuck up in all the years they'd known her. However, as her cakes and pastries were still appearing regularly at the king's table, they knew she was alive. Wherever she was, and like many of their fellow countrymen, the servants decided it was safest not to ask questions. Meanwhile, life in the palace dungeons had been utterly transformed. A stove had been fitted in Mrs. Beamish's cell. Her pots and pans had been brought down from the kitchens, and the prisoners in neighboring cells had been trained up to help her perform the different tasks that went into producing the feather-light pastries that made her the best baker in the kingdom. She demanded the doubling of the prisoners' rations to make sure they were strong enough to whisk and fold, to measure and weigh, to sift and pour, and a rat catcher to clean the place of vermin, and a servant to run between the cells, handing out different implements through the bars. The heat from the stove dried out the damp walls. Delicious smells replaced the stench of mold and dank water. Mrs. Beamish insisted that each of the prisoners had to taste a finished cake so that they understood the results of their efforts. Slowly, the dungeon started to be a place of activity, even of cheerfulness, and prisoners who'd been weak and starving before Mrs. Beamish arrived were gradually fattening up. In this way, she kept busy and tried to distract herself from her worries about Bert. All the time, the rest of the prisoners baked. Mr. Dovetail sang the national anthem and kept carving giant Ickabog feet in the cell door. His singing and banging had enraged the other prisoners before Mrs. Beamish arrived. But now, she encouraged everyone to join in with him. The sound of all the prisoners singing the national anthem drowned out the perpetual noises of his hammer and chisel. And the best of it was that when Spittleworth ran down into the dungeons to tell them to stop making such a racket, Mrs. Beamish said innocently that surely it was treason to stop people from singing the national anthem. Spittleworth looked foolish at that, and all the prisoners bellowed with laughter. With a leap of joy, Mrs. Beamish thought she heard a weak, wheezy chuckle from the cell next door. Mrs. Beamish might not have known much about madness, but she knew how to rescue things that seemed spoiled, like curdled sauces and falling soufflés. She believed Mr. Dovetail's broken mind might yet be mended, if only he could be brought to understand that he was not alone and to remember who he was. And so, every now and then, Mrs. Beamish would suggest songs other than the national anthem, trying to jolt Mr. Dovetail's poor mind into a different course, which might bring him back to himself. And at last, to her amazement and joy, she heard him joining in with the Ickabog drinking song, which had been popular even in the days before people thought the monster was real. The song goes like this. I drank a single bottle, and the Ickabog's a lie. I drank another bottle, and I thought I heard it sigh. And now I have drunk another, I can see it slinking by. The Ickabog is coming, so let's drink before we die. I think I've read that song before in here. Setting down the tray of cakes she'd just taken out of the stove, Mrs. Beamish jumped up onto her bed and spoke softly through the hot crack high in the wall. Daniel Dovetail, I heard you singing that silly song. It's Bertha Beamish here, your old friend. Remember me? We used to sing that a long time ago when the children were tiny. My Bert and your Daisy. Do you remember, Dan? She waited for a response, and in a little while, she thought she heard a sob. You may think this strange, But Mrs. Beamish was so glad to hear Mr. Dovetail cry, because tears can heal a mind as well as laughter. And that night, and for many nights afterward, Mrs. Beamish talked softly to Mr. Dovetail through the crack in the wall. And after a while, he began to talk back. Mrs. Beamish told Mr. Dovetail how terribly she regretted telling the kitchen maid what he'd said about the Ickabog. And Mr. Dovetail told her how wretched he'd felt afterward for suggesting that Major Beamish had fallen off his horse. And each promised the other that their child was alive because they had to believe it or die. A freezing chill was now stealing into the dungeons through its one high, tiny, barred window. The prisoners could tell a hard winter was approaching. Yet the dungeon had become a place of hope and healing. Mrs. Beamish demanded more blankets for all her helpers and kept her stove burning all night, determined that they would survive. Chapter 48. Exactly what I expected. Bert and Daisy find each other. The chill of winter was felt in Ma Grunter's orphanage too. Children in rags who are fed only on cabbage soup cannot withstand coughs and colds as easily as children who are well fed. The little cemetery at the back of the orphanage saw a steady stream of Johns and Janes who died for lack of food and warmth and love. And they were buried without anybody knowing their real names, although the other children mourned them. The sudden spate of deaths was the reason Ma Grunter sent John Basher out into the streets of Jeroboam to round up as many homeless children as he could find. To keep up her numbers, inspectors came to visit 3 times a year to make sure she was not lying about how many children were in her care. She preferred to take in older children, if possible, because they were hardier than the little ones. The gold she received for each child had now made Ma Grunter's private rooms in the orphanage some of the most luxurious in Cornucopia. With a blazing fire and deep velvet armchairs, thick silk rugs, and a bed with soft woolen blankets, her table was always provided with the finest food and wine. The starving children caught whiffs of heaven as Baronstown pies and Kurtzburg cheese passed into Ma Grunter's apartment. She rarely left her rooms now, except to greet the inspectors, leaving Basher John to manage the children. Daisy Dovetail paid little attention to the 2 new boys when they first arrived. They were dirty and ragged, as were all newcomers, and Daisy and Martha were busy trying to keep as many of the smaller children alive as possible. They went hungry themselves to make sure the little ones got enough to eat, and Daisy carried bruises from Basher John's cane because she often inserted herself between him and a smaller child he was trying to hit. If she thought about the new boys at all, it was to despise them for agreeing to be called John without putting up any sort of fight. She wasn't to know that it suited the 2 boys very well for nobody to know their real names. A week after Bert and Roderick arrived at the orphanage, Daisy and her best friend Martha held a secret birthday party for Hetty Hopkins' twins. Many of the youngest children didn't know when their birthdays were, so Daisy picked a date for them and always made sure it was celebrated, if only with a double portion of cabbage soup. She and Martha always encouraged the little ones to remember their real names too, although they taught them to call one another John and Jane in front of Basher John. Daisy had a special treat for the twins. She'd actually managed to steal 2 real Chauville pastries from a delivery from Ma Grunter several days before and saved them for the twins' birthday. Even though the smell of the pastries had tortured Daisy and it had been hard to resist them herself. "Oh, it's lovely," sighed the little girl through tears of joy. "Lovely," echoed her brother. "Those came from Chauville, which is the capital," Daisy told them. She tried to teach the smaller children the things she remembered from her own interrupted school days, and often described the cities they'd never seen. Martha liked hearing about Kurtzburg, Baronstown, and Chauville, too, because she never lived anywhere but the marshlands and Ma Grunter's orphanage. The twins had just swallowed the last crumbs of their pastries when Basher John came bursting into the room. Daisy tried to hide the plate, on which was a trace of cream, but Basher John had spotted it. "You," he bellowed, approaching Daisy with the cane held up over his head, "have been stealing again, ugly Jane." He was about to bring it down on her when he suddenly found it caught in midair. Bert had heard the shouting, had gone to find out what was going on. Seeing that John Basher had cornered a skinny girl in mud-patched overalls, Bert grabbed and held the cane on her way down. "Don't you dare," Bert told Basher John in a low growl. For the first time, Daisy heard the new boy's Chauville accent, but he looked so different to the Bert she'd once known, so much older, so much harder-faced, that she didn't recognize him. As for Bert, who remembered Daisy as a little olive-skinned girl with brown pigtails, he had no idea he'd ever met the girl with the burning eyes before. Basher John tried to pull his cane free of Bert's grip, but Roderick came to Bert's aid. There was a short fight, and for the first time in any of the children's memories, Basher John lost. Finally, vowing revenge, he left the room with a cut lip, and word spread in whispers around the orphanage that the two new boys had rescued Daisy and the twins, and that Basher John had slunk off looking stupid. Later that evening, when all the orphanage children were settling down for bed, Bert and Daisy passed each other on an upstairs landing, and they paused, a little awkwardly, to talk to each other. "Thank you very much," said Daisy, "for earlier." "You're welcome," said Bert. "Does he often behave like that?" "Quite often," said Daisy with a little shrug. "But the twins got their pastries. I'm very grateful." But Bert now thought he saw something familiar in the shape of Daisy's face and heard the trace of Chauville in her voice. Then he looked down at the ancient, much-washed coveralls onto which Daisy had had to sew extra lengths to the legs. "What's your name?" he asked. Daisy glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Daisy," she said. "But you must remember to call me Jane when John Basher's around." "Daisy," Bert gasped. "Daisy, it's me, Bert Beamish." Daisy's mouth fell open, and before they knew it, they were hugging and crying as though they'd been transformed back into small children in those sunlit days in the palace courtyard before Daisy's mother had died and Bert's father had been killed, when Cornucopia had seemed the happiest place on earth. I'll stop there. I'm not going to tell you the name of the next chapter because I did that last time, and I kind of feel like it ruined the surprise of who said gotcha. All right, so there you go.